for companies coming from abroad or founders that are coming from abroad, there are really only two types of entities here in the U.S. that are probably going to be that are probably going to make sense for you, which are the corporation and the limited liability company. There are other types of entities. There are partnerships, for example, of different types: general partnerships, limited partnerships. And there's a special type of corporation called an S-corp, and another type of corporation called a close corporation. But for when you have foreign investors, when you're a company from abroad, what probably is going to make the most sense for you is to incorporate either a corporation or to form a limited liability company. And just very briefly about sort of what the difference is between those two entities. So the big difference has to do with how these entities are taxed, and also sort of the formalities surrounding, setting up one of these entities and administering these entities. So a corporation is a bit more formal. So there's more formalities surrounding its incorporation and also the way that you administer it going forward. So you have to have a board of directors, you have to have certain officers, president, secretary, treasurer, and there's more formalities that are required in order to maintain that corporate form and to make sure that creditors, other third parties won't be able to challenge that corporate form and say that, no, you're not really an entity, it's just the shareholders and they've just set up this entity as a shell. So as a corporation, there's more formality there. With an LLC, there's much less formality. There's much more flexibility regarding the management of the entity. It can be managed by a single manager. It could be managed by the owner or owners of the company. And you don't have all these other requirements, for example, of annual meetings and of having particular officers, et cetera. So that's an advantage. Taxation is one of the other big differences here. The default tax treatment for an LLC is that it's what we call a pass-through entity. So the LLC entity itself doesn't pay taxes, and all the profits and losses of the business pass through to the owners of the LLC, like with a partnership. Whereas with a corporation, you have what some people refer to as sort of double taxation. So the corporation itself does pay taxes, and then if the corporation pays dividends up to the shareholders, then at that point the shareholders may also realize gain and have to pay taxes, based on their gains from those dividends. So you have those two layers of taxation. For companies coming from abroad, they really should talk to a tax advisor and lawyer to understand sort of their particular circumstances, because there could be situations where it would make more sense for them to have an LLC and others where it would make more sense for them to have a corporation. If it's a company, if the type of company that you're establishing is sort of a traditional startup company that is looking for VC investment, venture capital investors, then typically you would want to be a corporation, because that's just what investors here in the United States anyway are used to investing in. And there's a lot of concerns that some investors have in investing in limited liability companies because of that pass-through tax treatment. So another option, just to mention it quickly, is if you sort of like the flexibility and ease of administration of an LLC, but you want to be taxed like a corporation, it is possible for an LLC to choose to be taxed like a corporation, which is another option. But which one you choose sort of depends on sort of tax factors and also what sort of entity you want to be. One other note that I'll just make quickly: if you are a startup and you are going to be operating here and have employees here, with corporations, it's a lot easier to issue stock options and other forms of incentive compensation, like restricted stock. With an LLC, it's not impossible to do that, but it's a lot more complicated, both to set it up and to administer it going forward. With LLCs, you have to do this thing called profit interests, which are a little bit more complicated and not as well known and familiar to people as traditional stock options in a corporation. So that's another thing to consider. If you're going to have employees here, most people are used to getting stock options in a corporation. There's very clearly understood tax benefits to getting stock options if you set it up the right way. Whereas with an LLC, it makes it a little harder to offer that sort of equity compensation to your employees.